program went really good. Alright, let's start. So, my name is Kamyar and I'm presenting my topic today, Identity for Citizenship, Experiences of Afghan Refugees in Turkey. So, I want to begin by discussing the story of a young man I met this summer by the name of Kamyar. We'll be calling him Kamyar today. Who recently arrived to the city of Kayseri, in central Turkey, where I was doing my field work, researching the situation of Afghan refugees living in Turkey. The refugees I was living among were some thousands of Afghans, waiting for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, as we're going to be referring to it today, to take them out of Turkey and resettle them in a Western country. However, Hamid was not one of the refugees formally awaiting resettlement from UNHCR. Instead, Hamid was supposed to be smuggled to Germany. He, like many others, had traveled from Afghanistan over here to Iran and through Iran, all the way to the western coast of Turkey, just barely off the map. He was taking buses through countries and walking over the mountain borders at night to avoid guards who have permission to shoot on sight if they see any illegal border crossers. From Turkey, he was supposed to be put on a boat and then travel to Greece with that boat, from where he was to find his way to Germany by land or any means necessary. Hamid had made various attempts with smugglers to get from the western coast of Turkey up to Greece, which would be just off the map. Finally, on his last trip, the boat had sprung a leak, and his fellow passengers had drowned. Hamid was the only survivor, he told me, because he was a strong swimmer and was able to reach the shore. Temporarily, he'd come to live with some acquaintances. These acquaintances were Afghans awaiting the formal resettlement from the UNHCR. When I asked him what his plans were for the future, suggesting he might try to register as a refugee as well and seek resettlement, he paused for a moment, and then he responded, "For now, I don't know. I just know one thing. There's no point in spending any time in Turkey." It was clear to me in that moment, Hamid was going to attempt that same journey one more time. And unfortunately, stories like Hamid's are not entirely surprising, given the situation that Afghan refugees and asylum seekers face in Turkey. Since 2012, I've taken 2 trips to Turkey to observe their life firsthand and talk to refugees about their experiences, their future, and their perspectives on the world around them. From dealing with very mundane issues like just trying to rent an apartment without any form of identification, to greeting new refugees just hours after a night journey across the border, I had a great chance to gain valuable insights into an often neglected refugee population. My research question seeks to investigate how Afghan refugees in Turkey experience and conceptualize citizenship in terms of their political, economic, and social struggles. Through this, I hope to develop various understandings of modes of citizenship while documenting the experiences of this growing population of refugees. And just for my presentation today, I want to make it clear why so many refugees like Hamid would choose to forego a chance at resettlement from Turkey and the United Nations, and instead risk their lives crossing borders and taking to the sea for a direct shot at reaching Europe. Just some background, I began this project in 2012, and this summer was the culmination of my research with over 1 month doing ethnographic fieldwork, living with Afghan refugees in the Turkish city of Kayseri. Nice picture of a semi-downtown right there. I conducted interviews with refugees, was a participant observer of daily life, and spent time volunteering with an organization made up of refugee advocates known as the Coordination Group of Afghan Refugees. I also interviewed officials of Turkish NGOs and analyzed documents related to the situation of Afghan refugees living in Turkey. Estimates for Turkey's population of Afghan refugees places the figure at over 50,000 by the end of this year. As you can see here, this makes Afghans the second largest refugee population of the country, second only to the Syrian population. This number actually might be larger by now. Turkey as a site for Afghan refugees seems unexpected, especially because of the vast geographical distance between the 2 countries. They don't even share a border. But there's some interesting reasons for why Turkey would be a place for such a large Afghan population to exist. It's one of the few states in the region that has both safety for Afghans and a semi-working UNHCR network. Also, Afghan refugees in Turkey come not just from Afghanistan, but also diaspora in Iran and Pakistan. The reasons for migration are very diverse. I can't get into them today, but they're always combinations of economic instability and varying risks of religious, socially, and ethnically motivated violence. But even more interestingly, some refugees end up settling in Turkey with UNHCR as a sort of plan B. As you can see, it's a very vital crossing point to move further into Western Europe. The difficulty and the cost of the journey at this point leads many Afghans to apply for resettlement when they can't move beyond Turkey, when their funds run out or they have issues with their smugglers. Therefore, you can't collapse the term Afghans in Turkey onto the term Afghan refugees. Some are just passing through, and some are actually working as undocumented laborers without recognition by the state. Now, in a typical context, we use the term asylum seeker and refugee like this. When someone's fleeing their country, we call them an asylum seeker, and when they're granted asylum, they're known as a refugee. Seeking asylum in Turkey, however, involves a different arrangement between the UNHCR, Turkey, and a resettlement country. Even though I've been saying Afghan refugees in Turkey throughout this presentation, Turkey does not actually grant a non-European asylum seeker refugee status. They're technically not refugees in the country. Turkey maintains a reservation to the United Nations Refugee Convention that says refugees from non-European countries cannot actually stay there. They are never really refugees. Instead, refugees who come to Turkey enter an alternative three-step system. They first enter the country. They can then register as temporary asylum seekers with the UNHCR and the Turkish government. And then they have to wait for resettlement in a country like the United States, Canada, or somewhere in Western Europe like Germany or the UK. During this process, refugees are placed in a small city or town in Turkey which they're not allowed to leave. Now, there's UNHCR pamphlets that are given to asylum seekers that claim the average wait time is 3 years for the entire process, from the moment you set foot in Turkey to the moment you move west. For some refugee groups, this number of 3 years actually has some truth to it. It's an accurate representation. However, Afghans in particular have been waiting 6 years and counting on average for resettlement due to low quotas for Afghans in Western states. And unfortunately, this delay of resettlement is just one of many failed promises made by the UNHCR. From what I witnessed in the field, aid from NGOs and the United Nations is insufficient for any refugee and their family to subsist. To meet their needs, refugees obviously need to work, even those that are schooling age. However, Turkey does not allow refugees to work legally without acquiring a work permit. This permit being very hard to acquire and reserved almost entirely for skilled labor. This in spite of the fact that those same UNHCR pamphlets given to asylum seekers make the acquisition of a work permit seem feasible. Similarly, for their healthcare needs, these pamphlets promise refugees the state's responsibility for their health care. Instead, Afghans rely on local charities that have insufficient funding for their medical needs. When I sat down with refugees to discuss the right to health care, the right to work permits, and everything else outlined in these pamphlets, someone remarked from the crowd, "Oh yes, we have all these rights, but only in our dreams when we sleep at night." Refugee humor. Therefore, nearly all refugees have no choice but to work as illegal laborers in what are typically harsh factory environments where exploitation of workers is common. One day while I was walking to the grocery store, I ran into my friend Rahim while he was on his way home from work. Before I could even open my mouth and say hello, Rahim told me, he was just leaving work and he was in a really bad mood because of his job. He went on to detail how his boss pays him less than the minimum wage, he's forced to work overtime just to keep his job, and when his boss decides not to pay him, he has no form of recourse. If he would go to the police and ask them to mediate the situation, as something we would do here, they would fine him, and that fine would be up to 3 months, 3 times that month's pay. And unfortunately, his experiences with the authorities and with his work environment are far from uncommon in this situation. So now that I've presented a sort of general look at Afghan refugee life in Turkey, I want to get into how the concept of citizenship plays a really important role in their lives and experiences. And this helps us understand why some Afghans would choose to be smuggled rather than utilize the resettlement process. Now the thing is, typically when we think of refugees, we think of people without citizenship. However, I'll be using these two categories from James Holston and Arjuna Padarai to apply citizenship to the refugee. See, we first start with the term formal citizenship, which refers to the entire range of formal legal titles a state can confer on a person. This includes resident and citizen, but also refugee or asylum seeker. Substantive citizenship refers to the rights that come with these various legal titles, such as the right to reside in a state, the right to participate in government, the right to work, or the right to health care. Now, previous discussions of rights struggles throughout history foreground formal citizenship as the primary vehicle for obtaining substantive citizenship rights. So the assumption here is that the individual lacking in some of their substantive rights can and should gain them by seeking more formal citizenship first. That means gaining some kind of legal category. However, by expanding the concept of formal citizenship to look at categories such as refugee or asylum seeker, this research complicates the link between substantive and formal citizenship rights and actually demonstrates how substantive citizenship might not be linked to formal citizenship and how a greater formal legal status might not actually be the gateway to larger experiences of substantive citizenship rights. So in terms of our project here, my project, excuse me, a temporary asylum seeker is the formal citizenship category that we're using. Classical understandings of rights struggles would suggest that Afghans who experience weak substantive citizenship rights should alleviate their issues by increasing their formal citizenship status. In this case, by registering as a refugee. But in conversations I had with refugees who were involved in the process, there was a different impression of this first step. In one such instance, I was speaking with two heads of households. Let's call them Mr. Ahmad and Mr. Reza. Yeah, some good Afghan names there. Who were discussing their experiences with the UNHCR bureaucracy and their reactions to being told that their resettlement delays were not a priority and their indefinite wait for resettlement has no likely end in sight. Mr. Reza begins by saying, the UNHCR doesn't resettle Afghans. If this is the case, there's two things the UNHCR should do. Either don't accept the Afghans or don't register them and let the Afghans understand. Let them stay in their own country and die and not come all this way here. As the conversation went on, Mr. Ahmed tried to suggest that maybe the United Nations was registering the refugees to stop them from getting on boats. Mr. Reza had this to say. But why should the UNHCR even accept the refugees? What's the reasoning behind this pointless acceptance? The refugees here can't study. It puts a black cloud over your life. The refugees here can't work. They can't study. They're here living in uncertainty. Being accepted as a refugee here just puts a black cloud over your entire life. In this conversation, we see acquiring refugee status articulated as something other than a step on the path towards full substantive citizenship. While registering as a refugee elevates the individual in legal terms from an undocumented and illegal status to now a temporary resident, refugees like Mr. Reza and others suggest that this promotion in formal citizenship was actually a demotion in substantive citizenship rights, a black cloud over one's life. And indeed, registering as a refugee does entail a sacrifice of freedoms that come with remaining undocumented. Unlike unregistered Afghans living in other cities like Istanbul and Ankara, formally registered Afghans are unable to move within Turkey, where there could be more lucrative jobs or better housing options. This restriction of freedom is unique only to the registered Afghan refugee, because by becoming a temporary asylum seeker and shedding that undocumented status, they are being forced to stay in the city they're assigned to, and they can now be monitored. And what's gained in return to these freedoms? The past few years here have shown that there's no guarantee of resettlement for any of these refugees. Most would frankly be better off applying for refugee status once they've already been smuggled inside a Western European country. In fact, in the same conversation, Mr. Ahmad went on to say that had he not been deceived by this false hope of resettlement, he would not have given up so much to settle in Turkey. He said, if the UNHCR didn't register us, we would have just kept going to Greece. Either we would have arrived or we wouldn't. Like many others, they either got there or they drowned. And Mr. Ahmad's wish, unfortunately, was the reality for Hamid, the young man we discussed at the start of this talk. And with his repeated attempts to reach Europe, even by risking his own life, we essentially see the failure of the resettlement process. The very idea of refugee resettlement is supposed to embody a promise of safety and the first offering of a sense of humanity that comes with citizenship. Instead, to people like Mr. Reza that we discussed today, it is no more than a black cloud over a refugee's life, a lesser form of existence. As many states attempt to criminalize and find ways to turn away asylum seekers, will we continue to vilify these men and women who agree to dangerous journeys, or can we maybe find culpable the system that took their rights and offered them little more than false hope in return? I'd like to leave you all today with a question to ponder that was actually posed to me during what was supposed to be an interview. This is one of the first interviews I'd done with a young woman by the name of Fatima. She was a refugee whose family had fled not just Afghanistan, but also Iran. She said she was a refugee 2 times over. And she asked me this, and I hope maybe you all can think about it today. You know, wherever we go, they always ask, why'd you come here? But why don't they ever stop and ask, what was so bad that made you leave? Thank you all.
So our next speaker is Adriana.